New College of Florida's 690 plus students, staff, and faculty, welcome to the Independent Public Honors College for the state of Florida. I'm Tasha Bradley, and I'm the director of the New College of Florida Diversity and Gender Center. And tonight we are making history. I think that deserves a clap. So therefore, it is no less fitting that we embark on this journey together here at New College of Florida, a college dedicated to intellectual inquiry. Tonight, we begin the conversation and we make history together in the spirit of the Angola settlement. So with that, it is with great honor that we are able to participate in this event as New College of Florida, and it is my pleasure to introduce Vicki Oldham, Project Director for the Looking for Angola project.
Wow, oh my goodness, you all look so beautiful. I am so glad you came tonight. First, I'd like to thank the Florida Humanities Council because without them, there would be no Looking for Angola public education series. And you'll be finding out more about the state historic preservation grant that we received later on in the program, but a little bit more about the Florida Humanities Council. They are dedicated to fostering community and a sense of place in Florida by providing lifelong education programs like this that explore Florida's history and heritage, literary and artistic traditions, cultural values, and ethics. I'd like to introduce you to the Looking for Angola Advisory Board. Of course, I'm the project director, and you've met Tasha Bradley, and each advisory board member, if you could please stand as you hear your name called. Cynthia Newell is the president of Neighborhood Leadership Initiative, Incorporated. She stood. Okay. Lewis Robinson, Dr. Robinson is director of Manatee. He's a director in the Manatee County School District. Dr. Uzi Baram is a professor here at New College. Dr. Cantor Brown is a FAMU professor. Bill Berger is on the advisory board. He is an independent archaeologist. Lynn Gumley. Many of you know Lynn Gumley. He's a community activist and retired television producer and one of my mentors, whom I love dearly. And I love all of you advisory board members. You know that, right? Dr. Rosalind Howard is a professor at the University of Central Florida. Is Dan Hughes in the house? He is an archaeologist at the Sarasota County History Center. Bob Fitzgerald, he is president of ASALA, and that is the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Ann Shank is a historian at the Sarasota County History Center. And Ann is working somewhere. There she is in the back, waving. Kathy Slusser is supervisor of historic resources for Manatee County. Where is Florence Tate? Florence Tate provides much. Okay, Florence Tate is our public relations consultant. And Linda Turner is a local historian who has helped us out with this program so much. I've got to tell you how this all came about. I am very happy to give you to let you know how it did too. In 2003, the truth of the matter is I was at a crossroads in my life. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Crossroads, transition in life. That was me. I was wondering what to do with the rest of my life and where to go and feeling quite nervous about it, I will admit. At the time, I was contracted to complete a script about the history of Sarasota County. It was a documentary script. And I included the story of Angola because I had met Cantor Brown, say, some 12 years ago, 13 years. This story was not in the original script. It was not left out intentionally. So little is known about the Angola settlement. By the time we edited the final script, only a few sentences about Angola made the cut. It's a complicated story, so I understood as we were editing why we couldn't include so much about the history of Angola. We finished the Sarasota County history video, but the Angola story kept playing in my mind. I kept thinking about the courage, the determination, and the enterprise of the people that I had read about. And I kept thinking about the risks that they took in search of freedom. And I kept thinking about how these people were making it on their own without depending on their slave owners. And I was empowered by this story in a way that I cannot describe to you. And I do get chills every time I talk about it. Pardon me. Every time I start talking about that part, then this happens. Somehow I drew comparisons in my own life and I saw some parallels. And I realized that I wasn't so nervous anymore about my decisions. I knew I'd be fine. I knew I'd survive just as many Angola inhabitants did, who didn't have the resources that I have. So I set about to tell the Angola story in a documentary. So I organized a conference call to see if there would be support for this story. And at the end of our conference call, with historians like Jan Matthews and Marion Almy, and Cantor was in on the call. Somebody else was in on the call. I'm sorry if I'm forgetting your name, but at the end of the conversation, I knew what I had to do. So next there was grant writing and organizing the project. Every grant we sought was approved. And I want to tell you tonight that this is the beginning of a very long-term project that includes, but is not limited to, an archaeological survey to find artifacts of Angola. No study, I learned, has ever been completed. A public education lecture series, this is the start of that. An education component to allow high school students to participate in a real-life archaeological project. Another education component to include this story in the social studies curriculum in Sarasota and Manatee County schools, as well as statewide. And scholars, there are many more books that need to be written about this story. You know that, right? There is a documentary in the works about the story. But as I said, this is only the beginning. The goal is to make sure that this story is put forth, that others' lives can be empowered just as mine was. America loves a survivor's story, right? Well, this is the ultimate survivor's story, a comeback story. Looking for Angola, ultimate. It's happening in our own backyard. Maybe literally, as Uzi Barab might tell you. But anyway, join me in this journey of discovery. We're going to pay tribute to the Angola inhabitants now with Dennis Clove and soloist Margaret. Thank you.
After listening to you, I had prepared something. And then after listening to you, I thought, well, okay, all right then. So change the script. This is a song that says, when you walk through a storm, hold your head up high and don't be afraid of the dark. At the end of the storm is a golden sky and the sweet silver song of a lark. In other words, from what you were saying, no matter what it looks like, and if you don't have what you think you need to do what you need to do, walk on through the rain, walk on through the wind. Though your dreams be tossed and blown, for you will never walk alone. When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high and don't be afraid of the dark. At the end of the storm is a golden sky and the sweet silver song of a lark. Walk on through the wind, walk on through in tribute, I think it's only fitting that I share a Negro spiritual. I've been buked and I've been scorned. I've been buked and I've been scorned. Children, I've been buked and I've been scorned. I've been talked about, shows you's born. There is trouble all over this world. Oh, there is trouble all over this world. Children, there is trouble all over this world. There is trouble all over this world. But I ain't gonna lay my religion down. Ooh, I ain't gonna lay my religion down. Children, ain't gonna lay my religion down. Said I ain't gonna lay my religion down. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much for setting this atmosphere. I feel the spirit of the Angola inhabitants with us this evening. We thought it would be proper to show you some work that's going on in the field to find this Angola settlement. So there is a video that we produced, and thanks so much for suggesting it, Lynn Gumley. In the true spirit of a TV producer, visuals, visuals, visuals. A picture can paint 1,000 words. So here's what we're doing, and you'll find out about this research. We'll start it out in the Bahamas, and then we'll move it to Manatee County.
Ancestors who had the courage to face place
Live in red bays on Andros Island, the offspring of free and fugitive slaves tell harrowing stories of their ancestors' narrow escape from death and destruction in Florida.
What we're doing here today is what we call standard shovel testing.
Some historians and anthropologists believe archaeological testing now underway will connect the accounts of Red Bay's residents with documentation they already have about the existence of an early 1800s black settlement near the Manatee River called Angola. Bill, this is a historic moment. What's happening right now today?
Well, today we're beginning the fieldwork on the Looking for Angola project. We're in East Bradenton. We're going to be testing these parcels by digging test holes every 5 meters, which is a little over 16 feet, systematically over the entire parcel to see what's here.
Well, I'm anxious to see what they're going to find. I mean, earlier there was a piece of a bottle that didn't look modern, and I thought that was kind of neat.
Archaeologists are looking for bits and pieces of glass, pottery, tools, and evidence of daily life that provides clues to fill out the Angola story.
Archaeology, in a way, is the most important type of historical research because it actually documents what has been written. People will pass down information and there's no documentation that what they said was true until you do the archaeology and you find evidence and then you say, there's the clue. It really did happen and this is how it happened.
This would be a prime area for people to have lived from the Angola settlement, given that very close by, just behind you, is the location of the Manatee Spring, a flowing spring, source of fresh water.
Historians have accounts from military records, diaries, and journals that point to the existence of Angola. Why should you care about uncovering the settlement's history? The story is important because it highlights Florida's role as a beacon of freedom to refugees from slavery. The story also has national and international relevance, as you are about to find out.
We don't understand it better by and by. Say but one of these bright morning, bright and soon. Now the cricket, now the spirit, don't let go.
Okay, we are about to start this program, the panel discussion. I'm going to introduce you to a friend of mine, and I do consider you a friend, Bill Maxwell. He was with the St. Pete Times for 10 years as a columnist and editorial writer. Currently, he's a scholar in residence at Stillman College. Bill is a Florida native. He received a BA in English from Bethune-Cookman, an MA in English from the University of Chicago. He spent 2 years at the University of Florida in graduate school at the School of Journalism, yay, my alma mater. Now he is currently writing a weekly column for the Tuscaloosa News and a monthly column for the St. Petersburg Times, and he's training a new generation of journalists. Join me in welcoming back to the Sun Coast, Bill Maxwell.
Good evening. I have a low voice, so if you can't hear me, tell me, and I will try to raise it up a little bit. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm glad to be back. I wouldn't have come back if Vicki hadn't asked me, I don't think. I left landlocked Tuscaloosa to come back to beautiful Sarasota with all this water and palm trees. So nothing could get me away from Tuscaloosa except Vicki. I hope you know that's a joke. I was glad to leave Tuscaloosa. And all of those Republicans. Okay, but we're not talking about that tonight. I'm going to ask the panelists to just come up one at a time because you're going to introduce yourselves and we're going to do some very special things. So would you please come and take your seats. These are all scholars, okay? And that means that I've got to control these guys, okay? They start talking and they won't stop. So I've told them already that if there's going to be a bunch of nonsense tonight, I want to hear a bunch of it from a lot of people and not just from them. So I'm going to give you all a chance to ask them questions. So we're going to spread this around tonight. And so I think that we should go for about an hour up here, and then we're going to let you all ask your questions. I think that's the best way to do it, because I'm sure you have some great questions. So why don't we start here and just tell us who you are and why, very quickly, why you found this project interesting.
Thanks, Bill. I'll be brief. I'm Professor Uzi Baram, and I teach anthropology here at New College. I had Vicki Odom come to my office, I guess sometime in the summer, and Vicki was basically a hurricane coming right in, and with her excitement, enthusiasm, I had trouble saying no to her. I have a deep commitment to public archaeology and engagement of the past with the present, and I think of myself as on this panel and part of this project in terms of the public archaeology as well as the local academic anchor.
I'm Dr. Cantor Brown. I'm a professor of history at Florida A&M University in Tallahassee. I'm here because I had the privilege of, in the modern era at least, being the first historian to write about Angola. And I find it impossible to believe that was 15 years ago. But I cannot tell you how delighted I am, despite the passage of 15 years, to see all of you here to learn about and appreciate this magnificent place, Angola, that was here. And I wanted to take one quick moment for a personal note. In Vicky's remarks, she seemed to indicate that her real connection with Angola began in 2003, and she was lying to you. Let me set the record straight. I first wrote about Angola. The first publication came out in 1990, which was a scholarly article followed by a book that came out in 1991, so 15 years ago. The only broadcast journalist in the world who expressed interest in that story was Vicky Oldham. And to my delight, she has tenaciously clung to it ever since. And I cannot express enough appreciation and respect for what Vicky has done and what she is doing with this project. So, Vicky, personally, thank you so much.
Good evening. I'm Bill Berger. I'm an independent archaeological consultant, an alum of New College and of the University of South Florida, Tampa. Over the years doing research on various projects, I come across interesting little tidbits about our local history, which I then file away, and sometimes I can actually find those files again. Years ago, I ran across mention of an early settlement on the Manatee River concerning two British citizens who were executed by Andrew Jackson, and it was always a puzzle to me. Subsequently, I read some of Cantor's material, and it brought the puzzle back to light. And shortly thereafter, I got a call from Vicky Oldham, and hopefully the rest will be history.
And archaeology.
And archaeology.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Rosalind Howard. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Central Florida. You can't hear me? How about that? Okay. Rosalind Howard, assistant professor of anthropology at University of Central Florida. My research interest recently has been mainly about the intersections of Native Americans and African peoples, specifically the Black Seminoles of Florida. And I got interested in this project and when I was approached by Vicky Oldham, who had heard about my work with the Black Seminoles in the Bahamas from Cantor Brown. My research in the Bahamas was centered around a community on Andros Island where about 300 descendants of the Black Seminoles who left Florida, some of them from Angola, as we'll get into later on, but they didn't know anything about their history in Florida, the history of their ancestors. And so this is a wonderful way for me to tie that together for them as well as for the history books.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Louis Robinson, and I've lived in the Sarasota area since 1963. My interest actually comes because I have studied history for a number of years, but at the same time I'm also an educator, so I guess that makes me a history educator, or historian. But at the same time, I know that there are those out there who have little knowledge of Angola, where it is, what it is, and what it stands for. But more importantly, from the vantage point, anytime, moreover, there's the issue of individuals that greet you in the halls and say, oh, by the way, I thought Angola was a prison in Louisiana. I said, you're right, but that's not all about Angola, okay? So that's why I'm here.
Okay, I first heard about Angola. I was in Birmingham at the airport. I got a telephone call on my cell phone from Vicky. I had just come back from New York City, and I was getting ready to go home to Tuscaloosa, and she said, Bill, have you heard of Angola? I said, sure, it's in Africa. It's a prison, you know, I have friends there. So, but I never heard of it. And I've been here all my life. I've written about Florida. I've been everywhere. Had never heard about it. And I had not read Cantor's piece
Although I would point out, Bill, you've known me for years.
I've known him for years, right. He didn't tell me about that piece he had written. So, with that, why don't we get down to it? I think this is a very important project. Let me start with you, Cantor, because your piece started the whole thing. Exactly how did this area, this township, this settlement, how did it?
Community.
Okay, how did it come about?
Well, as we're, of course, still putting the puzzle together, but what we know now is that in 1812, Northeast Florida, of course, Florida was still Spanish, suffered a war that began with an invasion of Georgians who were going to take over Spanish Florida. Indians, Seminole Indians, and their black allies fought those Georgians in what's now Alachua County near Noonan's Lake. In fact, the lake is named after the commander of the Georgians. They beat the Georgians, but they were afraid that the Georgians were going to come back with reinforcements, so they melted back into the peninsula for their own protection. Now, historically, the Seminoles, in fact, Indians from all over the American Southeast and the Seminoles' black allies had come into South Florida every winter to hunt. We're talking about the first tourists. And it was a nice thing. You come down here, you hunt a little bit, you get some pretty plumed birds and some deer skins, trade them with a Cuban fisherman, you make a little money to take home, everybody's happy. And it may be that there was already a settlement that the blacks traditionally had come to here. We don't know that. But after this battle in 1812, some black warriors and their families came down here for protection. The first mentions I found were in the aftermath of that battle. The community here was enhanced in 1815 after the Battle of New Orleans, when some black warriors who had been in the British Army appeared to have been brought here by an English officer. More came after the First Seminole War in 1818, when this is one of the most heroic stories in Florida history. I just have to take a second to tell you. Andrew Jackson illegally invaded Spanish Florida in 1818 in part to avenge earlier resentments against these same black warriors, as well as some Creek Indians who had formerly been in Alabama but also had come into Florida. The Creek Indians escaped across the Swanee River as Jackson was chasing them through the Panhandle. But the blacks were trapped on the west side of the Swanee River at what's now Old Town. To enable their families to escape with their lives, 400 black warriors fought off Jackson's entire army for a day and then escaped themselves. Most of them, we believe, then came to Angola. As a result of which, by late 1818, early 1819, we estimate that probably somewhere around 700 or 750 individuals lived in Angola. If so, that made Angola one of the largest towns in Florida. So we are talking about a settlement of considerable significance, peopled by black warriors who repeatedly had fought for their freedom, many of whom had been trained by the British Army in the War of 1812.
Okay, now this follows then. Rosalind, to you then, what happened to these people once their settlement was destroyed?
Well, the settlement was destroyed in 1821, and the survivors who managed to escape took canoes and whatever transportation they could get and came down the Gulf Coast of Florida through the Keys up to the point called Cape Florida, which is now known as Key Biscayne. And from there, it's estimated 150 to 200 of them sailed to the Bahamas, either in wreckers, which were ships that were piloted by privateers who were rescuing, quote unquote, cargo from ships that had crashed on the reefs, either wreckers or in canoes. And it was known that the Seminoles knew how to build large dugout canoes with sails. And so they managed to get to Andros Island, which is the largest island in the Bahamas, and it's about 150 miles from the Cape Florida. But crossing the Gulf Stream in a canoe is a very, very dangerous thing. And so the people now of Red Bays really hold that history very dear to their hearts. They feel that their ancestors were very brave people to have crossed that Gulf Stream in canoes. Well, once the people from Angola got to Cape Florida and congregated, left for Andros, they weren't received by the British in the Bahamas readily. In fact, in 1819, a Seminole chief, Kanaji, went to Nassau to ask for the help that the British had promised them, to fight against the Americans who were trying to take over Florida, take over their land. But the British refused, and so in 1821, the group who left knew that they weren't going to get any cooperation or assistance from the British in Nassau, so that's why they landed on Andros. And they landed in a spot on the island that was uninhabited, and still, that's the only community on that side of the island today. It's muddy coastline, shallow water, which they chose strategically because they didn't want the ships to come in and take them back to Florida and re-enslave them. Well, when they got there in 1821, they lived there subsisting on the plantains and peas and corn that they were growing, as well as from the sea. And 7 years after they got there, the British customs officer discovered them. They had been living there for 7 years, and so that's how I understand that the date was 1821, that they actually arrived, and it was 1821 when the Angola settlement was destroyed and the people left there and left from Cape Florida. So that's where the connection now comes, which is a story that I think I mentioned earlier that is not a part of the oral tradition of these descendants in the Bahamas. They really don't know what their ancestors were doing in Florida, where they lived, any of those details, and so this is why this is so exciting, to be able to connect the ancestors to the present-day population.
All right. Next question then. Why the name Angola? And second question, and anyone can take this one, is why have we not heard about this until now? What dynamics made it impossible for us to know that there was an Angola until this time? Who's it? You going to handle that one? You're laughing a lot.
I think it's all scholars looking at each other trying to figure out which one will say what. The name Angola comes from two Cuban fishermen who were living on a rancho off the mouth of the Manatee River in 1821, and they put in a land claim for, I believe, 640 acres each at the Manatee River, and they referred to that land as Angola. And that's what's entered into the archival record as the name of the place. In terms of why it's not better known, I think that actually starts opening up a lot of the important issues. We've heard a little bit about the historic significance and the anthropological significance for the people in the Bahamas. The silences in our history, as you pointed out, having lived in Tampa Bay for so many years, is telling Angola was very much a threat, and the notion of Angola. The fact that people ran away from slavery, went deep into Florida under what must have been very challenging conditions back in the early 19th century, makes it clear that no one wanted to be a slave, that no one thought it was acceptable to be on a plantation, and that there were not any good masters treating their slaves nicely. And that my sense is very much that as we think about Angola, we give lie to the racist assumptions that slavery was somehow acceptable to the people who are enslaved.
If I might, a little further on the name Angola, as Dr. Baram mentioned, we do have this account from the federal records from Fort Brooke, today's Tampa, of these two unconfirmed land claims by two Cuban fishermen, the Caldiz brothers, and they use the term Angola. But beyond that, it's another puzzle we're addressing. We know that in the 16th century, the Portuguese made their way down along the west coast of Africa, further and further south, ultimately to the Cape of Good Hope and around to India thereafter. When they got down into the area that today we call Angola, the African country, they found the Ndongo people, and in their language, Ngola meant chief. And taking that term, the Portuguese gave that area the name of Angola. However, in further historical accounts of the slave trade, the term Angola is applied to the western coast of Africa from Sierra Leone all the way down to Namibia. So it's still a puzzle as to the origin of the term Angola vis-a-vis our settlement on the Manatee River.
Okay, let's just take this a step further then. Uzi, to you again. Is there race in this archaeology? And do you expect to find, what do you expect to find? You expect to find African Americans? You expect to find runaway slaves? Exactly what are you looking for? And is there race in this?
As an archaeologist, I think both me and Bill find things. We tend not to find people. And so our search, and you saw in the video, Bill is very good at the excavations and finding material remains. That actually is quite helpful in the historical archaeology that underlies this endeavor. Anthropologists are fond of saying that there's no biological basis for the division of people on racial grounds. That race is a social construct that divides us up into different categories, and as such, race is a social relationship. What we hope to find is material evidence for people who were somewhat different from the larger communities of North America at the time. They well could be objects that are distinctively African influenced. There will also be objects that look very much like typical 19th century materials that you'd find in Georgia and Alabama or elsewhere. The most significant component of any archaeological investigation is context. That those holes you saw Bill digging are dug very carefully so that we're quite sure about the relationship among the artifacts. And so we won't find race, because race is just a social notion. But we hope we will find some evidence of people who are resisting slavery and trying to live their own lives on the Manatee River.
It is quite a task we have before us as cultural materialists to identify quote-unquote race in physical items. Uzi mentioned some items that we might expect. Well, some such as early 19th century materials could as easily be ascribed to the Cuban fishermen or Seminole Indians. But to put the color black on it, per se, is rather more difficult. The hope is that there will be ethnic artifacts, if you will, that are clearly of African origin. Now, to draw an analogy, some of you may have seen coverage of the African cemetery that was uncovered in New York City. And while much of the organic material had rotted away, there was one instance where a design of tacks was still in place in the ground, uncovered with great care, which is what we do as archaeologists. That's why we're using our little whisk brooms and toothbrushes and so forth, not to disturb the material before we can map it. And that tack design was clearly an African design. So it in part helped to indicate that was an African cemetery. Not to say that I'm necessarily looking for human remains in this instance, but other aspects of culture can express ethnicity, particularly ceramic types. Now, some years ago, some local collector along the banks of the Little Manatee River up in Ruskin uncovered a wooden drum, which is clearly an African-style drum, without any question whatsoever. It's not Seminole. It's definitely African.
I should be so lucky as to find something organic.
I think we can even, if you don't mind, Bill, I'll even go a little further with Bill's presentation. Maybe Ganter can help us with this. Angola is clearly an important part of African American heritage, but also is very much a beacon of freedom. Oh, sorry. Thank you for reminding me. I'm used to bellowing. I'm not used to using a mic. Ganter might be able to help expand on this. Angola is very much part of African American heritage, an important component of remembering certain events that occurred here. But it also is a beacon of freedom. And I don't think only Africans enslaved were the ones going to Angola. We know of the Seminoles, who are also living in this area, who intermarried and had different sorts of relationships. And my sense from some other work that's done in the Caribbean, that these maroon communities also included whites who didn't find the social order acceptable. And so we should expect what, in today's language, we would call a multicultural community.
I think that's exciting, and I hope you find it. One thing I could point out, we think of a community as if it were static. You know, it's just self-contained and nobody comes and goes. This would have been a crossroads. Again, Indians from all over the American Southeast, from as far as the Memphis, Tennessee area in the northwest to the Outer Banks of North Carolina on the northeast, would come into South Florida and Central Florida every winter to hunt. The Cuban fishermen serviced that trade. They made money off of it, as did the Seminoles. So we have to expect lots of comings and goings. Also, we have to expect that there were comings and goings from the British and the Spanish empires. In the raid that, I guess we will get into this in a little while, that destroyed Angola, the ship of a British officer, a major British officer, was in Tampa Bay and boarded by the raiders. We have out in the lobby the one artifact that may or may not relate to Angola, but I think there's a good argument to be made that it is, that has to be classified as European trade goods. From an historical perspective, it seems to me that if we get lucky, and knowing how hard and determined Bill and Uzi are at this, we may find evidences of that. So don't think of this as some absolutely sparse frontier, isolated outpost where nothing ever happened. Lots of things happened here. Lots of human beings came and went. Lots of property was used or passed through. So if we get lucky and if we find the centers of settlement of Angola, or in my dream when Bill finds it and Uzi finds it, we have opportunities but not the certainty of finding all sorts of things.
Okay, the Brickell Avenue project in Miami, I think it's Brickell, right, where I was living down there then when they first discovered it. But if you keep digging holes in the ground here, Bill, and you keep finding artifacts, and if you get a critical mass of artifacts, of material, what do we have to look forward to? Will a special place be designated? Will we stop development? What's the future of this if we find a critical mass?
I appreciate that question, Bill, because I like to try to explain to the general public, homeowners, governments, others, that archaeological sites do not prevent development. Property is private. Now, if human remains are found, it does take more time to remove them, but they can be removed and then development proceed. But again, there are no federal, state, or local laws that prevent development when there's an archaeological site. This is a general perception of the public, which is incorrect. Private property is the end-all of land in our society. Now, when I find significant remains from this shovel testing, which is what we call phase 1 testing. This is systematic examination by spacing small test holes.
When we find something very significant, we then would open an excavation unit, what most of you would probably generally think of as archaeology from various films and things you've seen. Square holes dug with a trowel carefully, layer by layer, with everything mapped and photographed. But when this would occur, it would be from the permission of the private property owner where such finds were made. Further, I make the point that anything found on private property belongs to the private property owner. Now, many of you, I'm sure, have followed the story of the Miami Circle that Bill made reference to. Now, ultimately, the state of Florida, we bought that property for about $26 million. However, the landowner did not have to sell it. It was private property. Very important site, and it's good that it's preserved, but he did not have to sell it to the state. Oh, $26 million was probably quite an enticement.
Okay. Now, Lewis alluded to Andrew Jackson, and I know, Cantor, you have a lot to say about Andrew Jackson. What I want to know is tell us about the relationship between this man who was to become our president and this particular settlement. Just tell us how those dynamics played out.
You want me to start?
Well, either one of you, either one.
Or you want to start? Andrew Jackson was in a very unfriendly and continuing relationship with the residents of Angola. He had invaded Spanish Florida 3 different times. In each instance, in one way or another, he came into conflict with black warriors, free black warriors, we often call them maroon warriors, who were going to end up here at Angola. As I mentioned, as late as 1818, they fought a pitched battle of 400 maroon warriors against Jackson's entire army for an entire day, called the Battle of the Swanee. This war, the First Seminole War, convinced Spain it simply couldn't keep Florida. And a treaty called the Adams-Onis Treaty was entered into. And to Spain's credit, a provision of that treaty guaranteed all residents of Florida all rights of a citizen of the United States, although that was subsequently disregarded, at least for the purposes of our Angolans. Jackson never forgot his anger at them, their resistance. And remember, he is a growing national figure by 1819, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. His eye is on the presidency, and he's going to run for the presidency in 1824 and actually get the most votes, although he won't get the presidency. I don't know how that could possibly happen. But it did back then. But so to gather his support base are Southern planters who are growing rich or anticipating growing rich with the spread of the Cotton Kingdom in lands that he is getting for them by evicting the Indians, essentially. And yet these black warriors continue to defy him and embarrass him. President James Monroe, as soon as the U.S. Senate in January 1821 ratified the Adams-Onis Treaty, asked Jackson, who then was living in Nashville, Tennessee, to become provisional governor of Florida to accept the transfer of sovereignty to the United States. His very first letter back to the president from Nashville asked for permission to send the United States Army into the peninsula to get the blacks and their Creek Indian allies. The Secretary of War wrote him back and ordered him not to do that. Within 2 weeks, Jackson's own Indian allies, led by William McIntosh, a man whom he had made a brigadier general in the United States Army, headed into Florida to destroy Angola. They got here in late May or early June of 1821, somehow overwhelmed the defenses at Angola, seized somewhere around 250 men, women, and children, and took them back into slavery. On the way back to the United States, almost all of them, quote, disappeared. Some of the survivors, several hundred, as Rosalind has so eloquently described, made it to to the Bahamas. Others made it into the interior of Florida to South Polk County, where those same Creek Indians that Jackson wanted to get them were living. Jackson goes on to then suffer the embarrassment of being deprived of the presidency in 1824. He will win 4 years later. The very first act of his administration will be the Indian Removal Act, to remove all Indians from east of the Mississippi. His first test area will be Florida. He never forgot. One quick additional note, the blacks and the Creeks didn't forget either. From villages, one called Minotee, the black village that in South Polk County that the refugees from Angola found, they call Minotee, presumably after Manatee. From that and a Creek village where Fort Meade, my hometown, is now, they planned the Second Seminole War, which began in 1835 and became one of the longest Indian wars in U.S. history, but more importantly for our purposes, the largest slave rebellion in United States history. As General Thomas Jefferson said, this is not an Indian war, this is a Negro war. So the legacy of Angola was not to give up the fight for freedom. It was not to surrender Florida as a beacon of freedom. It was to survive, as Vicki said so well, and to come back and fight another day for freedom. What an incredible legacy.
Significant numbers of treaties were entered into between the United States government and the Indians, particularly, as Cantor indicated, the Creeks, Seminole Indians. Those treaties were entered into many times, and well, all of the time, for lands. Andrew Jackson, as a historical figure in the history of the South and the history of the United States, has played a major role, or played a major role in terms of many of those treaties not being honored. And so subsequently, as we read and learn more about his work and his antics and his raids in and out of Florida, particularly to gain revenge, we recognize that we need to rethink and we need to change our mindset with respect to the true work that he actually performed, or the work that he actually did in the state of Florida. And so when you take a look at the books, the history books, particularly the books that are written, and I think it was Bill Berger mentioned $26 million for a piece of property in South Florida. We spend that much on textbooks in school districts in a year's time. And what we're saying is that we have to begin to rethink and relook and rewrite those books with respect to the real history and what has occurred along the settlement in Angola.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Okay, I will come back to that, but that's your question later on. I want to ask Uzi a question now, though. I got to ask this because I'm a good columnist, so I got to ask this question. Is there a politics in your archaeology? And what's up with your politics here?
Yeah, there might be a little politics involved. I think, well, I guess I should start with thinking about politics, not in terms of the politics of who gets into office, but the politics in terms of decision-making. And decision-making in terms of what gets remembered and what doesn't get remembered. Mm-hmm. What gets commemorated and what doesn't get any landmark. And so when we think about what we know about a place, I think it's fair to look around and to look at what places are remembered and in what ways. And if we look around this region, I think on one level, there's a lot of good folks who live here who don't have a sense that anything was here before the 1970s or 80s. That there's a sense of a newness. I teach at a place called New College. Everything's new. And so there's a level of just having a sense there have been people here. But then what they were doing, how they were doing it, is also a bit of decision-making. Much of, I think Louis was mentioning this, much of the history for this region starts with Fort Brooke and the founding of Tampa. And that's a decision. There's a nice national park dedicated to DeSoto, but there isn't anything or any place to go to that's related to Angola. And so part of the politics is just trying to, one, remember what was there, and two, to try to find a way to commemorate it. And part of that politics is to find some evidence that will allow us to think about how to commemorate. And if I can just have one more level to that, one of my fierce commitments when I introduced myself and my commitments to public archaeology, it's that it's not us up here telling the community how to commemorate or what to commemorate, but a sincere interest in hearing from you all about what you think is important from Angola, and in many of the small presentations, smaller venues, is as much to add depth to this history, but also listen really carefully to what you all think needs to be remembered from Angola.
Rosalind? Yeah.
I'd like to add to that. There's something that scholars call structural amnesia, and it's a disease that afflicts history. And it really means that what is important to those who are writing history and what is not important to them. What's not important to them gets left out. And that's how much of the history of these freedom seekers has failed to make it into the history books. And it is political. And it does have to do with race, although we as anthropologists know it's not a biological reality, it's socially very real. One of the ways that we can change that is, as Uzi mentioned, the people have to speak up and say that they want it changed. That has happened as far as Cape Florida goes. That's the place where I mentioned that the black Seminoles and Seminoles left from Florida and went to the Bahamas. There's an organization in Florida called the Florida Underground Railroad Project that I'm involved with, and we've been working for several years to get that spot designated as a historic site, and that will happen. A plaque will be placed on February 22nd near the lighthouse there at Key Biscayne.
Okay, now, no, this is, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to let you all have it, these folks up here. Louis, I know it's important to you. How do we get this into the public school system? I don't know if we have any textbooks where this is mentioned. Cantor, is your piece anthologized anywhere?
Not to my knowledge in any textbook.
So we don't have any mention, a chapter about Angola.
No.
In any of our public, now I think that's abominable, but...
I would mention, Bill, and I was thinking, seeing Ann Shank in the back, the Sarasota County and its Historical Resources Office, ever since I first wrote about Angola, has been interested and has wanted to pursue this. And this is no slap at my friends in Manatee County, who are wonderful. But Ann Shank and her colleagues held the first conference and asked me to make a presentation about Angola right here in Sarasota. And it was the next morning that Vicki interviewed me for the first time. So we owe a real debt of gratitude to Ann and to Sarasota County for their continuing interest and support.
Okay, so Louis, what do we do next?
You mentioned politics, Bill, and whether or not politics plays an important role in the histories of peoples. And I have to answer that most certainly. In order for this to become wide range and broad based, it has to be infused into the minds of the historians, into the people that write the histories. Now, I would venture to say that the folks that are sitting on the audience right now are either at some point history buffs, or you have an understanding of history to some degree, or you wouldn't be sitting here. And maybe I'm wrong. But then I might ask the question, if we're talking in 1821, and I said you 1865, and we know that the war between the states took place in 1865, and we know that there's significant history in our textbooks on the war between the states, then why is there no history in our books right now about Angola? Well, virtually because nobody knew about it. And that's what we're trying to do now. We're trying to change that. So how do we get it widespread? We have to find it, do more writing about it, publicize it and find the major textbook companies that are involved in publishing these kinds of materials in the books that our children read and get it published.
All right. Okay, so let me stop there, and let's look this way now. How about you have any questions and observations? Please make them, and I'm going to ask you to keep your comments to only about a minute, if even that. So don't go on and on. Okay.
Can I take a shot? I'll take a shot. Mrs. Brown, it's good to see you. That's, Cantor alluded earlier to Ann's work here in Sarasota County. Oftentimes, it can't begin on a large scale, but that's not necessarily to say that that's not a route that you can go with respect to getting the information to the hands of students so they become more proficient in their understanding of their history. And so it becomes the responsibility of people like myself who work for school districts and others to begin to write those curriculum ourselves rather than depend on others. And every school district has, for the most part, a curriculum department responsible for those kinds of things. But the impetus for that has to come from the folks like you that are sitting in the audience that are becoming more and more knowledgeable about the importance of this project. Because just like anything else, unless you are able to put pressure or bring pressure where it needs to be bared so that school districts and school boards recognize the importance of writing those curricula and then putting them in the hands of our kids and our teachers first, then it doesn't happen.
Well, let me ask a question I want to follow up on. Is there any mention of Fort Mose in the textbooks here in this county?
Little.
Okay, I find it quite incredible. Okay, yes, ma'am, in the pink.
Writing this kind of a story about Angola. Probably not yet, maybe, but wouldn't that be, I'm trying to get the children so that they'll get to use. You know what I'm talking about?
If I might, ma'am, your Abraham angle is rife with possibilities, and if you attend, got to give a plug for one of my talks in the series. Ralph Smith and I will be giving a joint talk at 13th Avenue Community Center, and it's on the schedule, which you can get here. Ralph portrays Abraham. He's an historic reenactor. He's a park ranger now at Fakahatchee Strand State Park, and he is one of the most exceptional historical reenactors I've ever had the pleasure to see or know. So you might come to that and talk with Ralph. He could definitely give you some imagery to do a kid's book on.
Okay, yes, sir.
Dr. Howard, you mentioned the lack of the oral tradition of settlement out in the Bahamas. What of written tradition has been written down or passed through, and/or has anyone researched the angle of this Angola property being a crossroad road of trade and so forth with the Spanish and/or the Portuguese, who undoubtedly used this port city as trade site?
Well, their oral tradition in Red Bay's community in particular, it's very rich, but it begins with the trip from Florida. There's nothing about while they were in Florida. They, as far as I know, they don't have any knowledge of Angola, like so many don't. We're just all becoming knowledgeable about it. And hopefully we'll be able to find in the historical documents, I was just talking to Candor today about possibly getting a list of names of people and hopefully matching them up with the names of the people in the Bahamas to add to that tradition.
Rosa, there is one thing. Some of stories that were written down in the 1830s and 40s do mention coming from Tampa Bay. So it's not, but it's a very vague kind of thing. It doesn't mention the name of a community or the Manatee River, but they do mention coming from Tampa Bay.
Now, I'm personally very excited at the potential in the Cuban archives, which are being copied by a group out of UVF. They started 2 years ago. As far as the Cuban fisherman angle, there could be a real gold mine of information relating to Angola, archivally, from those sources.
One quick thing, I can't let Dr. Howard be as modest as she naturally is. When you ask what the written record is, she has written a wonderful book called Black Seminoles in the Bahamas. Dr. Rosalind Howard, Black Seminoles in the Bahamas, University Press of Florida.
Available
Think
in
of
the
your
back.
holiday gift-giving list.
Thank you, Ken.
Okay,
Thank you. Yes.
Gentleman right here, yes, sir.
My name is Carl Gregory. I wanted observation and then a question. The observation is, if you have a program like this again, try to interest, okay, but I'm sorry. My name is Carl Gregory. I'd like to make an observation and to ask a question. The observation is that if you have a program like this again, try and interest C-SPAN or now David Brancasio or Bill Moyers, because the content of this has national, if not international importance.
You're so right. I did contact C-SPAN, and I got turned down by C-SPAN, but that does not mean that I won't keep trying C-SPAN and other national outlets. I know it has national significance. Oh, and thank you for reminding me, we've had 2 interviews conducted by the BBC because,
Oh, great.
yes, throughout Africa, the Portuguese speaking countries as well as the English-speaking parts of Africa have know now about this story because I was interviewed, Uzi was interviewed, and Cantor was interviewed. But this is just the beginning.
Fine.
I think you're going to see a lot more in the national press about this story.
Just in addition to the observation, a couple of things makes this particularly timely and important to get national recognition for this. One is you've got a diversified panel, a diversified audience, and the focus really is not on race but American history. It's a colorless analysis, but recognizing the truths of our history, which has been covered over in our. My question is, assuming that in the excavation you continue to find things that indicate that there's really a major project here that is worthy of substantial support. How does the funding, how do you find, will you be able to find enough resources?
Did you bring
to
a checkbook?
continue this? What do you say?
I believe Cantor was donating part of the proceeds from his book. Weren't you, Cantor? We of course, as far as the fieldwork side of this project, which I'm directing, we're operating under a State of Historic Preservation grant and aid, and I feel very secure that we will be able to get additional funding from that source, providing our first phase, give some good indications. And Vicki is very adept at finding us grants.
We should stress on the state grant, by the way, from the Division of Historical Resources of the Department of State. Putting together the grant was a gargantuan effort that Vicki undertook at the last minute, and we could not have asked not only for a better person than Vicki to do it, but for more cooperation from the Florida Department of State. And the committee, when we appeared to plead our case, could not have been warmer and more receptive and put us very near the top in priority for any of their grants. So we thank them from the bottoms of our heart, as we do the Florida Humanities Council.
One of the things we're going to be doing is passing the collection plate through the audience before you leave the city. But no, on a serious note, obviously the kind of thing that happens in a project like this, as it takes on a life of its own, we hope to, and we become more recognized throughout the world, that the funding begins to come, because obviously you have to have funding for this to move forward at the rate we'd like to see it move.
Let me just make one comment, then I'll come back to the next question. The comment about race, I can't let that go so easily. I got to mention one thing about that. And Cantor, you tell the story about the massacre by Indians and not by. But let me just tell you this: is that don't be too eager to be to ignore the fact that the thing that we have designated as race does indeed exist, and that it does indeed give us amnesia, that we forget certain history on purpose. We ignore certain history. So let's not become too American here. Just remember that we have done some things to groups, and we do demand that certain people do not remember what happened to them. Matter of fact, Rosalind, you're dealing with a situation where people do not remember anything about what happened to them before they left this country. So, Cantor, would you comment on that?
Well, I have to think of a couple of ironic aspects of things. One, the historical marker that appears roughly where I think the heart of the Angola community, in which I will defer to Bill and Uzi, but relates to the building of the Braden Sugar Plantation. A gang slave operated. I don't believe that marker, unless it's changed, credits the slaves with actually building that plantation. But of course, nothing commemorates the great beacon of freedom that had existed on exactly the same site just 20 years before. But it helps us understand why the memory of Angola had to be wiped out. When you build an economy down in this area, or in Florida generally, or in the South, and it's based upon the uncompensated labor of thousands or hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of slaves, you simply cannot tolerate history preserving the memory of men and women and probably even children who were willing to fight and die to keep their freedom. And we have continued. We honor old historians by continuing to believe that if they were around and heard the original stories, they wrote it all down. But as Rosalind said, much of history is not written down. And I think we all feel a real special honor to be able to be involved to try and resurrect those memories. And you mentioned something that struck me, that the ideal in academia, and so many of us are in academia, is collegiality. And it's one of those things often sought and seldom realized. What a delight that we can operate in such a wonderful and warm collegial manner. It is the thing we dream about, and at least in my case, my dream came true.
If I could just, for a few moments, trials we made to try to divorce issues of race, but when we talk about a project, or we talk about a project like this, there's no doubt that it invokes certain emotions, because now you're looking at rethinking, and I said this earlier, you're looking at rethinking the whole issue of history of a culture and a state and a nation of people. And so that evokes a certain amount of emotionality among people. And so it's not always easy to recognize that you may have to take a back seat, as it were, given certain events that might have transpired. So when we look at the issue of race, in my opinion, sometimes you have to be a little more candid and a little more fierce in terms of your conversations with where you're going with that. The same issues, what would have happened in the war between the states in 1864 and 65? Oh, let me back up. Would there have been a war between the states in 64 or 65 had Andrew Jackson not invaded Angola? That to me is an interesting question.
Okay. All right. Right here, sir.
While we're getting the mic, let me just as a technical point, we always have to qualify things. I don't want to leave the impression that somehow Andrew Jackson was down here on this raid. We have no specific documentary evidence of Jackson ordering the raid. It appears from circumstances to be a reasonable conclusion that either he ordered it or his subordinate, Brigadier General William McIntosh, undertook it believing that that's what he wanted. But we do want to be careful not to sensationally suggest somehow Andrew Jackson snuck out of Nashville and made it down here. That is not the case.
But what we're talking about here today is history. And I think this brings up a very good point, and that is your history doesn't begin with you. Your memories don't begin with you. Your memories go back as far as you can read and as far as your own living ancestors can tell you about your history. But it doesn't begin with you. And the project that you're working on is a phenomenal project. It's about people at a search for freedom. And there's a reality here that it didn't go on only here at that time. When I was a kid growing up in New York State, I found out there was a group in the Ramapo Mountains called the Jackson Whites. The Jackson Whites were an isolated group consisting of runaway slaves, Ramapo Indians, and Hessian soldiers who deserted during the American Revolution. So I think, Vicki, after we finish with this,
Lynn,
we're going to find how many places like this in this country have people been seeking for freedom that nobody knows anything about, and we can make a national story out of it.
Okay, let's go way back yonder.
Could I just add something before
Yes.
that person starts talking? There was another community that wasn't so far from Angola. It was called Piliklakaha. And that is where Abraham was, he was the leader of that community. And it was what's called a black town. And a lot of times the black Seminoles were not living in the same village as the Seminoles. They lived in adjacent villages, which were called black towns. So there is not just Angola. There are more stories in Florida about the freedom seekers that need to be told. But of course, we're going to concentrate on this one first.
I like that term.
Okay, yeah.
I wanted to add, my name is Rosalind Ellerby, and I'm from North Jersey, the area where the Jackson Whites live, the towns of Hillburn and Suffern, New York, right near the New Jersey line. Much research has been done. People are still being interviewed, the older generations who still live in that area. Writings are on file at Ramapo College and other colleges in that area. But I also wanted to comment, as growing up in the North as a youngster, you talk about memories of history. We did a thing called geography. These young people don't know anything about it. It's all combined now and called social studies. History was separate from geography. We learned maps and we looked at our globes. And when we studied Africa, I can remember emphasis on things like Tarzan and Cheetah and Jane and the Pygmies, and that was Africa. But when we studied Egypt, I think everyone in our class left thinking that Egypt was on the continent of Europe. Every Cleopatra looked like Claudette Colbert in my day, and tell her my age, and Elizabeth Taylor.
You look
We
very
did
young to
not
me.
associate Egypt as being on the continent of Africa, and that these people were Africans.
I've got a mic here. I have never heard of Angola before, but I have read books written by American historians about slavery in the United States, mentioning a number of marooned colonies in southern Georgia and northern Florida. And I'm just wondering, suggesting perhaps, that if their stories, and something is known about a number of these places, be combined with the Angola story, it would become more of a topic that you could see on television. People would gain a greater interest in it, because there are other stories than Angola, that serve the same purpose.
And we should acknowledge that the tradition of maroons in Florida goes back at least as early as 1565 with the founding of St. Augustine, and almost certainly for decades before that. Florida stood out as a beacon of freedom from slavery, from its very organization as a Spanish colony. We do think there are some special aspects to Angola's story that distinguish it, and that will be part of what our educational mission is about. Did I say that the right way? Over the next months and years. But we want to hold a few things back.
Okay. One question for everybody is, how do you find the article written by Dr. Brown on the web? And the other question is, are there any other sources of information of Angola that are available to the public?
Dr. Baram whispered in my ear, for $15.95, he'll mail it to you.
I can find it again,
One of the things, this project, we hope with all our hearts is going to grow. And as Vicki mentioned, we hope not only will a national documentary come out of this, or even international, given the interest we've already seen, but any number of publications. We don't know exactly what that will be right now, and how
As a
we
struggling
all mix.
anthropology professor who needs to make publications, you can bet I'll be making some.
Dr. Rosalind Howard, University of Central Florida. But the original article with the most information was published in Tampa Bay History, the Journal of the University of South Florida History Department, in the fall of 1990. And most libraries around here will carry that. I understand that they've got, and you may want to look at them, some. I wrote a book called Tampa Before the Civil War a few years ago, and it does give all the context for the founding and the destruction of Angola, and why sugar culture then came to this area. And some of the personalities, names you'll recognize, were involved in that much earlier than much of the local recorded history would suggest. And are they available to look at out here? And there's not a huge amount about Angola specifically, but certainly some, and a lot about the context of early settlement down here. So if you want to look at that.
One of the things that we have at our disposals now certainly is the web. How many people have heard of WebQuest? Okay, WebQuest is a way that you can actually design a curriculum and post it, and anybody in the world can take a look at it. And that's the beauty of living where we live now, because we don't have to completely depend on textbooks and the written word. We can post it. Now, there are good WebQuests and there are not so good WebQuests. But if we post that, then that information gets out much quicker, but we have to make sure that it's good information that we're putting out there.
And if I might interject, I was kind of amused by your question, since there's at least 2 dinosaurs up here on the dais. It's Cantor and myself. Neither of us have email.
I just want to...
There was no email in Angola either, though. I believe Tampa Bay history was put online at some point, and I think you can go right to it.
But I guess I would want to add, I mean, I'm very gratified to hear of the comments that ask us to think about connections with other Maroon communities, other freedom-loving people from the time period. I'm gratified to hear about books for children and other sources. You know, I would say about 2 decades ago, any project like this, the scholars would have just gone and done the work that the ethics of the archaeology and even the historical research would be to go find all the facts, and then if we got lucky and discovered something, then announce it. Under Vicky's leadership, we've turned that upside down and followed the ethics of a new archaeology quite well. I'd love to be able to tell you there's a whole bunch of articles and books. But part of our quest is to not just do this work, but as all the panelists have made clear, to make sure we involved the descendant population, the people on Andros Island, that Rosalind Howard has good connections with, the Seminole nations, both I assume in Oklahoma as well as in Florida, and you all, the local communities in Sarasota, Manatee, and Tampa Bay, and for us to listen really hard. This, as I remind Vicki, is a very long-term process, and we want community involvement throughout the process. I think those books will take a little longer to publish, but they're going to be much better books when they do come out.
All right. I'd just like to know, with regard to the site that was shown in the video, where the preliminary work is being done, could you let us know or tell us, or you are at liberty to let us know where that location is? Being a native of this area or what have you, and you know, hearing about Angola.
You can assure us you haven't got a shovel in your trunk, right?
No. I promise you, I will not invade it. I will not do anything of that nature.
No,
but I would be interested to know just approximately where it's located.
We currently don't have like a website to let people know exactly where we are, but what you saw in the video is in East Bradenton, near the area of the Manatee Spring, which was the subsequent settlement area of Manatee, today's East Bradenton, all small privately held parcels. Now, I am doing additional work in other areas which shall remain undisclosed for the time being for security purposes. When we applied successfully for the grant, when Cantor and Vicki and I were up there defending our grant application, this was a concern from the state of Florida's archaeologists, security on the sites that we were going to examine. And this is something that's been stressed throughout. We are going to share the information, of course, but until we have accomplished our field work, we're not going to be letting everyone know just where everything is being done. But I'm sorry to say there are collectors, there are vandals in our communities, and so we want to protect these areas until we've done our work.
But also, if any of you live on the Manatee River or have good friends who have property up and down that river or nearby, and they happen to mention putting in their garden and finding some nails or some glass or some pieces of pottery that just doesn't seem to make sense, just seems a little too old, please tell them to call me at New College.
You know, the challenge, something to understand too, there isn't just a site. If there were 700 and 750 people, as I believe there were by 1821 at Angola, this is a rural community that was based on agriculture as well as trading. To have farms, to have homesteads, to have some sort of who knows, community or defensive center or centers requires a large area of land. And it amazes me that individuals as talented and busy as Bill Berger and Uzi Brahm are willing to undertake that challenge, particularly in an urban environment. And it just speaks to me to not only their great dedication to their profession, but their great humanity as well, that they would undertake a challenge. It is a massive challenge.
Well, I must make one pitch then, and I saw one hand. There may be some young people here tonight who are interested in the field of archaeology. What can you tell us? What do you say to the young folks?
Well, I get it regularly from people. It's like, how, you know, I always wanted to be an archaeologist, and I'm sure Tony has heard this, or pardon me, Tony out in the audience, Dr. Andrews, and Dr. Brahm, Uzi on stage here tonight. And I explained to people, I started picking up rocks when I was a little kid and stuck to it and made a career out of it. But whether it's archaeology or any other profession, I like to stress to young people with whom I deal, do something you enjoy. Don't get stuck into a dead-end job where you're just looking to make money to pay bills. Enjoy your work, I think, is the key, whatever your profession is.
Okay, so one more question. Yes.
I'm Dogfish. I've only been here 32 years and went to New College for a little bit. This is my neighborhood in a way. And you mentioned dinosaurs, and you hear about a lot of industrial parks uncovering them and then reburying them real quick. You know, that's been a part of the history of Florida. A lot of it is real estate. But as far as funding, we have a super fund cleanup, because you said there's a bunch of territories that might be possible. Talavast is not going to have people in it. They're it's going to be empty. From American Beryllium, and that was, how long ago did they close? 10 years more?
Yeah.
It had to be at least 10 years ago. The other thing that is significant to me and relates to history and race is there would not have been a celebration of the 60th year of the liberation of Auschwitz if Hitler had won.
Okay. All right, Vicki, you want to come in? Okay, I'm sorry, I see nothing back here. They keep popping up on me.
That's okay. My question was for Dr. Howard, and I was wondering if when she spoke with the descendants on Andros Island, if they were able to identify Angola by name, or what sort of information did they give her to allow her to independently verify that they were indeed from descendants from Angola residents?
I don't have any evidence of that. They don't have any oral history that goes back beyond the actual disembarking from Florida. They don't have any information about Angola. However, how I have connected these communities is that I mentioned in 1828 this British customs officer discovered them there in this community. Well, he took 97 of these people to Nassau because he thought he was really protecting them, that they had been dropped off there by the Spaniards who were continuing the slave trade after the British had discontinued it. And he wrote these people's names down. And I was able to connect the history that was given to me by the descendants on Andros Island to the names on this list from 1828. So I know that verified for me that they actually did have ancestors who came from Florida in 1821. As far as now the connecting of them to Angola, that's something that we're going to have to do the work on now. Hopefully, as Bill mentioned, the records that are being copied by the University of Florida Special Collections, which I'm really excited to get into, hopefully we'll be able to find information there. And also, Cantor has mentioned to me, he has information of names of some of those people who were in Angola. Some of those names were written down. So possibly I'll be able to match those up with that list from 1828.
As we mentioned before, there is one connection back to Florida. In the 1830s and 40s, there were some court cases or newspaper reports of cases that quote the Andros Island residents as saying that their family or they came from Tampa Bay. So it's not mere supposition. They left Florida from where we have documentary evidence the refugees of Angola went. We actually have firsthand accounts of explorers along the coast meeting the refugees in Florida. The timetable is right. Their own memories of coming from Tampa Bay are right. The names are right. So many points of intersection that while no one could say all of the early settlers at Red Bays were from Angola, certainly some of them were, and most likely many, if not most of them were. Is that fair to say, Ross?
Yes, I definitely agree. And Jan Carew, who is an historian and scholar of many different areas, but he, in 1972, wrote an article that quoted a woman on Andros Island, not in Red Bays, but on Andros Island, and talked about the history that had been passed down to her. And that included a story about the battle at the Suwannee and how her people then left there and went to Tampa Bay. So, as you mentioned, it's all connected.
And as we talk through and you hear our distinguished ethnographer and historian lay out this dynamic, people in my academic specialization of historical archaeology who've worked on such projects have found at places like Fort Muse outside of St. Augustine, at Abraham's Old Town in central Florida, at the African Burial Ground in New York City, and at other Maroon community archaeological sites around the U.S., that the archaeology and the community involvement tends to encourage even more investigations. That as much as archaeologists at this point are relying on the historians to tell us what we might find, as we start thinking harder about the geography of the place, as we get a better sense of that area, and we start raising more and more questions, our hope is that we'll encourage people to look for more and make some more connections. And the track record is pretty good for that happening.
Okay, we have one announcement, and then we'll be through.
Well, thank you so much, and I hope that your interest in Angola is now piqued as mine was, certainly. And the president of the NAACP reminded me to let you know this. C-SPAN, regarding their not covering us, you can always call C-SPAN and express your disappointment regarding why they didn't cover this piece, because it is in part supported by your tax dollars, all right?
Or email them.
Or email, those of you who have email. The evaluation forms that are in your seats, please, please, this is so important to the Florida Humanities Council that you will fill this out and let us know what you thought about this program and subsequent programs that we're going to do. I'm going to mention our next program. It will be held at the Ringling School of Art and Design at the Selby Gallery at 7 this upcoming Thursday. This upcoming Thursday, there is a reception. Ringling School of Art wants your presence there. There is a book signing in the back after this program is over, as well as a reception. And I think that might Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Rosalind. And baskets from Red Bays. These were made by the artisans in Red Bays, sent to Sarasota specifically for this program, the baskets that are out in the lobby. So, with that, Tasha Bradley, can I conclude this program? And, all right, thank you so much, everybody, for coming.
A wonderful connection. It's been a pleasure. Gracious man, I have had the pleasure of meeting. Happy out of trouble. Yes, Bill was brief. I was trying.
That's a great idea. You know, actually, there is a man who lives in Sarasota who has a sailboat that comes out of Miami over to Africa. Yeah, he brought the baskets. Yeah, his name is Steve Sailor. He takes church groups, and they do their work on the island.
Why don't you? Well, I like the matter of discovery. If we were talking about people digging, and a matter of fact, checking all the wells that they may have, and they've given some indication that people in the past have been finding different things like dinosaurs at the digging, and the people have been advised to bury them quickly. They're just trying to bury history. So this is, it piques your interest and wanted to make sure you learn more and read more and discover more.
He is a World War II veteran, survivor.
She's trying to say I'm old.
And he tells, no, but he has a lot of information, stories that he tells me, what has happened to him as an American black and a soldier. And I'd like to see him share those stories. So,
writing a book that might do that.
Try to get a hold of him. His name is Ronnie McMahon.
Immensely. Yeah, it was informative. I just can't express how pleased I am. There's so much for us to learn, and there's so much, information to be disseminated. So I was glad to witness this beginning.
I enjoyed tonight very much. Vicki Oldham has come a long way. She has grown up in Sarasota. She has blossomed, and now she has found a project that will really show her capabilities. Okay.
That would not deter me at all, Yeah. So,
am I looking away or right in the lens? Wait a minute, stop. Cut off. Am I looking at you or am I looking in the lens? Okay. Well, this was an exciting evening to learn so much about history right here in our own backyard on the Sun Coast. For Manatee County residents and Sarasota County residents, they really need to get involved in this great effort of finding out whether or not these African Americans from long ago actually lived here in our backyard in a free settlement. And it's just tremendous to learn from a historical standpoint what this means. And it's so significant. I hope many youngsters in our area get involved. I hope many educators in our area make the youngsters in the public school systems especially involved in knowing about this great effort that's going on right here in Sarasota and Manatee counties.
It is important because as a youngster, my folks lived in the Palmasola area, that family, and we heard that we were mixed with Seminole Creek and the tribe out of Georgia. So I have a deep interest in then hearing that as a child and them not explaining. And then years later, I had a niece tell me, well, there was a settlement out in Palmasola. I said, yes, I want to hear some more about it. And to come to 2005 and find out that it is beginning to surface and that they are digging just blocks from where my family lived because they came here at the turn of the century. It's very interesting, and I want this project to continue, and I want it to grow, and I want it to get into because I'm an advocate down at the Manatee School Board to make sure that it get in our history, which it has to be there. Because it's time to correct all of the myths that we've lived through and all of the stories we've heard, not about us. It's time that these things come to the forefront. They've got to be there. Otherwise, the history that we've been looking and listening to is distorted. So it's time to correct it. It's time for correction.
This is a critically important thing for our children to know, to appreciate their heritage, to know that Florida has been a center of freedom, for all people, Indians, blacks, and whites too. And it's not something, as they said tonight by the panel, it's not in our history books, but it's just as important as anything else. It needs to be supplemented into our education at all levels. I wish there had been somebody from the school board other than Lewis, who was on the panel, who did a great job. But it was wonderful production tonight, and I'm sure glad I came.
Now I'm going to be tongue-tied. Because it gets across to people that we have a diverse community in Sarasota. It's not all lily white. And people don't know about it. I have spoken to so many people who say, well, what are their problems? I mean, everything is fine now. There are no problems. They don't know, and they're good people, and they don't mean anything bad. But they have no idea, some of the problems that are going on. And the more that we do to get across what the culture is and what the community is, it's better for everyone, and everyone gains from it. That's it.
Well, in a real sense, events like this is opening the new millennium to the truth and justice and facts of our history. We continue as a country and as a community neglect or avoid to look at the realities of truth as it relates to our history. And what is happening is our history has been told to us conveniently by the people that won or that were in power. And so here we are with an opportunity to invigorate a community such as the Sarasota-Manatee County area to take a look at another aspect of our history that doesn't necessarily look like the one we've been told in the past.
Anytime you have an opportunity to rewrite and review history from its very inception, particularly in the state of Florida, it's a wonderful opportunity to be able to say to Floridians, to Americans, and to people in the world that we have something to say. We have something to say as a people. We have something to say as a race. We have something to say as a diverse group of individuals, that the writing of the history in this state has to be reevaluated.
I think it was very significant tonight, not only because we're somewhat trying to ease the problems that we have here in Sarasota that stem from race and lack of knowledge, not communicating fully with each other. So I admire the work that the coalition is doing, and their kickoff is Sunday. And we need more of this. I mean, this is the time when we have to address our problems. And as I stated, they're world problems. It's not just here, it's everywhere. And we are a global community, so we have to address what's going on, not only here, locally, but we are a global community and we have problems everywhere.
I think it's really important that we know the depth as well as the breadth of our past. It gives color, it gives texture to our present. And the more we can find out about those parts of our past, then I think the richer we are in understanding why we're here and why this part of Florida has been so important over time. And it's not just the present, but great things were happening here 200 years ago.
For Angola is
is a great opportunity for the Tampa Bay area to really connect to a part of the history that's been left out. I think I'm excited about it. I think this is going to be an opportunity for the community to come together, and we're going to rewrite history. This is a wonderful event, not only for Manatee County and Sarasota County, but we're going to see an impact across the globe. And I'm just excited to have been here on this evening.
Okay. This event is quite important, not only for the people of Florida, but for the people of the Bahamas and the people of the United States and actually the world in general. It will help us to know more about the real history of Florida, the real history of the interaction of Native American and African peoples, and the struggles that they engaged in order to achieve freedom.
I thought tonight was really significant. This is the start of an educational program that will allow this community to know about an element of its history that is so rich and so exciting that people really won't believe it until they learn about it. A great evening and a great start to that process.
Protect. Where do I look? Okay. I am thrilled that so many people came to participate in the Looking for Angola project. It just tells me that my gut feeling was right, that there would be interest and it is a compelling story and it can empower and touch people just like it did for me personally. That's the thing that keeps me working so hard to make sure that this story is told. The fact that these people risked so much in search of freedom and they fought for freedom and they were so brave and so enterprising and so determined. That's why the stories we're telling, and I want our kids to get it so that they'll be just like they were. Determined, courageous, brave, enterprising, taking risks sometimes. It's a great story, and I'm so thrilled that I've been chosen to carry the mantle.
The scraps, they bring a box of scraps up to Red Base and they move them into the baskets.
How long does it take?
It depends on the size of the basket. It could be anywhere from a few hours to...
That's so good with it. I love this thick, I don't know even what to call it.
It's called thatch.
Thatch.
It's a palm thatch.
May I keep your card? Thank you very much.
Sing happy birthday, bro.
Okay, yes, while I'm thinking.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Mickey. Happy birthday to you.
How old are you
Thank
now?
You cannot pass 39.
Right.
Never go over 39.
All right. This is the most beautiful cake I've ever seen in my life. Come on.
That is beautiful.
Okay, so let's take it off the box.
The palm tree is
It's all edible. Watch the
You know what I would do if I were you?
What would you?
I would cut it here, here, here.
Around the flowers.
And
Okay.
leave the whole flower.
Okay, let's do that.
That is the way you want to cut it.
Okay, here we go.
Wait, don't cut it. Let's just look at it. Wait, get a picture.
Okay, here it is.
Well, then, don't get a picture of the garbage with the camera, with the cake.
Okay, here's the cake.
For herself.
Okay. This is my piece. Okay. Sonia, would you hand over the rest? Thank you very much. Thank you for staying.
No,
Oh.
I'm not.
Forks. Oh, I just put them up. Forks. Can you get that forks out of that bag, please?